This week, millions of people are watching a king fight his way home from a war that supposedly happened 3,000 years ago. But long before Christopher Nolan put Odysseus on an IMAX screen, scientists were quietly trying to answer a much older question. Not whether the Trojan War happened exactly as Homer described it, but who the people were who might have inspired it. And when the DNA finally came back, it didn't just answer that question. It rewrote the origin story of Western civilization itself. For most of us, what we know about Bronze Age Greece comes from two poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Blind Homer, singing of Achilles' rage and Odysseus's 10-year journey home, gave us kings, palaces, bronze swords, and a war fought over a woman named Helen. For centuries, scholars treated this as pure myth, beautiful but fictional. Then, in the 1870s, an amateur archaeologist named Heinrich Schliemann went looking for Troy using nothing but a copy of the Iliad as his map. He found a city. Later, at Mycenae in mainland Greece, he uncovered gold masks and monumental tombs. Suddenly, the legendary Bronze Age looked a great deal like a real place, with real palaces, real kings, and a real, sophisticated civilization we now call Mycenaean. Alongside it, on the island of Crete, archaeologist Arthur Evans uncovered an even older civilization, the Minoans, builders of the labyrinthine palace of Knossos, the world Homer's audience would have half remembered as legend. For 100 years, historians had a tidy narrative. The Minoans, a peaceful sea-trading civilization, gave rise to or heavily influenced the more warlike Mycenaeans, who then became the Greeks of Homer's epics. Where these people originally came from and how they were related to each other was left as an open question, filled in mostly with guesswork and long-running academic argument. It was a clean story, and clean stories are comfortable. A single cradle of civilization, one culture handing its torch to another, in something close to a straight, unbroken line leading all the way to the Greece we recognize today. Textbooks repeated it. Documentaries repeated it. For most of the 20th century, almost nobody had the tools to test it directly. But comfortable stories, and accurate ones, are not always the same thing. Here is the problem historians and archaeologists couldn't solve with pottery shards and palace ruins alone. Where did the Minoans and Mycenaeans actually come from? Two competing theories had been fighting for a century. The first, these were indigenous populations, descended directly from the first farmers who settled the Aegean thousands of years earlier, with civilization simply developing in place. The second, more disruptive theory, waves of migrants, possibly from Anatolia, possibly from the Eurasian steppe, far to the north, moved into Greece and Crete, bringing new languages, new customs, and new genetic ancestry with them. This second theory mattered enormously because it touched something bigger than pottery. It touched the question of where the Greek language itself came from, and by extension, where the deepest roots of European civilization actually lie. Skeletons and grave goods could tell archaeologists what people built and buried. They could not tell them who those people actually were, biologically speaking, or where their ancestors had lived 1,000 years earlier. That question required something skeletons alone could never provide. And there was a third possibility looming over both theories, one that made the debate even messier. What if the Minoans and Mycenaeans, despite building such different worlds, one of open palaces and frescoes of dolphins, the other of fortified citadels and gold death masks, were actually far more closely related to each other than anyone assumed? Or, alternatively, what if they were far more different, with Crete representing an entirely separate genetic lineage from the mainland? Every answer had major implications, and for decades, nobody could do more than argue. In 2017, a team of geneticists led by Iosif Lazaridis, working with colleagues across multiple countries, did something that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. They extracted and sequenced ancient DNA from the teeth and bones of Bronze Age skeletons. 19 individuals from Minoan Crete, mainland Mycenaean Greece, and the wider Aegean, some of them thousands of years old, some so degraded that earlier extraction techniques would have found nothing usable at all. The study, published in the journal Nature, was among the first to directly test, at the level of the genome, a question that had been debated purely through pottery styles and burial customs for a century. Not myth, not architecture, the actual genetic ancestry of the people who built these civilizations. This is the moment where the story stops being about broken pots and becomes about something written directly into human cells. Extracting usable DNA from remains this old in a climate as warm as the Mediterranean is notoriously difficult. Heat and humidity break down genetic material far faster than the cold soils of northern Europe, where most earlier ancient DNA breakthroughs had happened. Getting a readable genome out of a 3,000-year-old Cretan tooth was, in itself, a technical achievement. And what the data revealed did not simply confirm what archaeologists already suspected. It reshaped it. The results showed that Minoans and Mycenaeans were, genetically, remarkably similar to one another. Both populations derived roughly 3/4 of their ancestry from the earliest Neolithic farmers who had settled the Aegean region millennia before, populations with deep roots stretching back toward Anatolia and the eastern Mediterranean. This alone confirmed something important. These were not two entirely separate peoples. Minoans and Mycenaeans shared a common genetic foundation. But there was a difference, and it was the detail that changed everything. The Mycenaeans carried an additional genetic component that the Minoans did not: ancestry linked to populations from the Eurasian steppe, the vast grassland corridor stretching from the Black Sea into Central Asia. This wasn't a small statistical footnote. It meant that at some point before the rise of Mycenaean civilization, people, or their ancestors, had moved into mainland Greece from the north and east, mixing with the existing Aegean population and leaving a lasting genetic signature that Crete, isolated by the sea, never fully received. For a century, scholars had argued in the abstract about whether a migration like this had ever happened. The genome data did not argue. It measured. There's a reason this detail mattered so much to the researchers. Steppe-related ancestry is one of the most closely tracked genetic signatures in all of European prehistory because it shows up, in varying amounts, across huge portions of the continent starting in the 3rd millennium BCE. Finding it in mainland Greece, but not on Crete, gave scientists a way to place the Mycenaean world on a much larger map of population movement, one that connects the palaces at Mycenae to migration patterns stretching all the way to the grasslands north of the Black Sea. This steppe ancestry connects the Mycenaeans to one of the largest population movements in prehistoric Europe, a slow, complex spread of people and languages associated, many linguists believe, with the early branches of the Indo-European language family, the ancestor of Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, and most European languages spoken today. The Mycenaeans, in other words, were not simply Aegean people in isolation. They were the product of a deep mixing event, a fusion of the older Aegean farming population with newcomers carrying ancestry, and very likely language, from far outside the Mediterranean world. It's worth being precise about what this does and does not mean. This genetic data cannot tell us whether a king named Agamemnon existed, whether a city fell because of a woman named Helen, or whether a soldier named Odysseus ever sailed home at all. Ancient DNA describes populations, not individual heroes, and it cannot confirm the historical reality of any single event described in Homer's poems. What it can tell us is that the world Homer's audience imagined, a Bronze Age Aegean of interconnected, layered, migrating peoples, was closer to genetic reality than the simpler myth of a single, unbroken, homegrown Greek people. This is where the science becomes genuinely sensitive, because the question of where the Greeks came from has never been purely academic. In the 19th century, some European scholars were uncomfortable with the idea that the foundational civilization of the West might have significant roots tracing to Anatolia and the Near East, rather than existing in isolated, self-contained European purity. The genetic data closes that door firmly. Both Minoans and Mycenaeans carried substantial ancestry, connecting them to the wider Eastern Mediterranean and Anatolian world, not a separate, isolated European lineage. At the same time, the study also found something that matters for modern Greece specifically. The genetic profile of Mycenaean-era populations shows strong continuity with people living in Greece today. This is not a story of total replacement, erasure, or a lost people, with no modern descendants. It is a story of layered ancestry, persisting, in large part, into the present population of the region. That distinction matters, because ancient DNA research involving living, identifiable ethnic or national groups carries real weight, and overstating certainty about who really belongs to a heritage, ancient or modern, is a mistake actual geneticists are careful to avoid. Today, as a $250 million film brings Odysseus back to movie screens around the world, this research offers something the film itself doesn't: a genuine, evidence-based answer to where the Age of Heroes actually came from. Not Olympus, not myth alone. A real, datable population, shaped by real migrations, mixing with real earlier inhabitants of the Aegean over the course of centuries. It also reframes how we should watch a film like this: Odysseus, Achilles, Helen, Agamemnon. Whether or not any of them existed as individuals, the civilization they were imagined to belong to did exist, and its genetic story is now, for the first time, partially readable. The palaces at Mycenae, the ruins at Knossos, the city Schliemann uncovered at Hizarlik, believed by most archaeologists to be the site of ancient Troy. These are no longer just settings for a myth. They are physical traces of a real, genetically documented population whose story is still being pieced together, one ancient genome at a time. It's worth remembering, too, that this is still an active, ongoing area of research, not a closed case. Only a small number of Bronze Age Aegean genomes have been sequenced so far, compared to the thousands of skeletons still sitting in museum storage and unexcavated tombs. Every new genome adds resolution to a picture that is still, in many ways, a rough sketch. Future studies may well refine, complicate, or add nuance to the steppe migration picture described here, and that is exactly how good science is supposed to work. Here is the lesson underneath all of it. For 100 years, the question of where the Greeks came from was treated as a matter of language, pottery, and national pride. It took ancient DNA, extracted from teeth buried for 3,000 years, to show that the honest answer was more interesting than any single myth could allow. Not a pure, isolated people, not one simple migration, a layered civilization built from farmers who had lived in the Aegean for millennia and newcomers who arrived from far away, fused together into something that eventually produced palaces, poetry, and a war story that has outlived every empire that came after it. Homer never had access to a genome sequencer, but in a strange way, the story he told, of journeys, of mixing, of people from different shores colliding and blending into something new, turns out to be closer to the biological truth than anyone in the last 3,000 years could have proven. The past isn't a single clean bloodline waiting to be defended. It's a record of movement, and for the first time, we can actually read it.